A Promise Fulfilled. London, 1918. Rose Kensington had never met Captain Thomas Sinclair, but she knew his name. He was listed as missing in action. So when a letter addressed to her arrived, written in his hand, she froze. Rose, you don't know me, but I know you. And if you're reading this, it means I'm running out of time. Chapter 1. The Letter That Knew Too Much. The gaslight flickered, casting elongated shadows across the worn floral wallpaper of Rose Kensington's small London flat. Rain lashed against the window panes, a relentless drumming that mirrored the frantic beat of her heart. The letter lay on the mahogany table, a stark white rectangle against the polished wood, its very existence a discordant note in the carefully ordered symphony of her life. It was addressed to her, in a firm, masculine hand she didn't recognize, yet the name signed at the bottom, Captain Thomas Sinclair, was one she knew, a name etched in the cold, impersonal lists of the missing, a name that shouldn't be reaching out from beyond the grave. Rose picked it up again, her fingers tracing the slightly raised ink of her name. The paper was thick, expensive, not the flimsy, ration stock used for most correspondence these days. This was a letter meant to last, meant to convey something of weight, something forbidden. She'd spent the last 4 years, since the war began, meticulously avoiding such weighty matters. She volunteered at the local hospital, tending to the endless stream of wounded soldiers, offering a cool hand and a quiet smile, a carefully constructed barrier between herself and the raw, gaping wounds of the world. She kept her head down, her heart closed, her life a predictable routine of duty and quiet solitude. This letter threatened to shatter that fragile peace. The envelope had been delivered by a young boy, no older than 10, his face smudged with dirt, his eyes wide and knowing in a way that children's eyes shouldn't be. "Special delivery, miss," he'd mumbled, thrusting the letter at her and disappearing back into the swirling London fog before she could even offer him a penny. The anonymity of the delivery only deepened the unsettling mystery. With trembling hands, Rose finally broke the seal. The scent of sandalwood and something else, something faintly metallic and earthy, wafted up, instantly conjuring an image of a man she'd never met, a man who, by all accounts, was lost to the mud and blood of the French trenches. She unfolded the single sheet of paper, the crispness a stark contrast to the damp chill of the room. "Rose, you don't know me, but I know you. And if you're reading this, it means I'm running out of time." The words were stark, economical, yet they slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. How could he know her? She'd lived a life of deliberate obscurity, a quiet mouse in a world of roaring lions. Her only connection to the war was through the hospital, through the fleeting encounters with the broken bodies and haunted eyes of the men who returned. Had one of them spoken of her? But why? And to a captain, no less? The letter continued, each word pulling her further into a web she couldn't comprehend. "I've seen your photograph." Edward carried it with him everywhere. "He spoke of you often, of your kindness, your unwavering spirit, the way your smile could light up even the darkest corners of this godforsaken war." Edward, her brother, lost at Ypres 2 years ago. The wound of his death, though scarred over, was still tender, easily reopened. The mention of his name, the intimacy of the description, sent a fresh wave of grief washing over her. She hadn't allowed herself to truly mourn, not properly. She'd buried her sorrow beneath a mountain of duty, of practical tasks, of determinately cheerful smiles for the wounded. "Edward entrusted me with a secret, Rose. A dangerous secret. One that I swore to protect, even at the cost of my own life. And now, it seems, that cost is being demanded." A cold dread seeped into her bones. What secret could Edward have possibly possessed? He'd been a gentle soul, a scholar, more comfortable with books than with bayonets. He'd enlisted out of a sense of duty, a naive belief in the righteousness of the cause, a belief that had been shattered within weeks of arriving at the front. Rose had seen the change in his letters, the growing disillusionment, the creeping despair. But a secret? That seemed impossible. "I need your help, Rose. I know it's a lot to ask of a stranger, but Edward believed in you. He trusted you implicitly. And in this darkness, his trust is the only beacon I have left. The letter went on to describe a meeting place, a small, unassuming tea room near Charing Cross Station, scheduled for the following afternoon. It warned her to come alone, to trust no one. It spoke of coded messages, of hidden dangers, of a network of spies and double agents operating in the shadows of the war. Rose reread the letter several times, each reading further eroding her carefully constructed composure. The world it depicted was one of intrigue and peril, a world she had consciously avoided. Yet, the pull of her brother's name, the echo of his trust in this unknown captain's words, was too strong to ignore. She looked around her small flat, at the familiar objects that defined her safe, predictable life. The worn armchair by the fireplace, the stack of novels on the bedside table, the framed photograph of Edward, his youthful face smiling out at her, oblivious to the horrors that awaited him. Could she truly step outside this sanctuary, into the dangerous world this letter described? The rain continued to fall, the gaslight hissed softly, and the letter lay on the table, a silent challenge. A decision had to be made. Her carefully constructed world, built on the foundations of grief and duty, was teetering on the brink of collapse. The ghost of a missing captain and the memory of her beloved brother were demanding that she step into the unknown. And despite the fear that gnawed at her, a flicker of something else, a spark of defiance, perhaps, or maybe even hope began to ignite within her. She folded the letter carefully, her fingers lingering on the signature, Captain Thomas Sinclair. A name that was no longer just a name on a casualty list, but a living, breathing enigma, a plea from the beyond. A promise made and kept. Chapter 2. Whispers of a Missing Captain. The tea room near Charing Cross Station was, as Captain Sinclair's letter had described, unassuming. The copper kettle, its sign proclaimed in faded gold lettering, nestled between a bustling tobacconist's and a dusty bookshop. The air inside was thick with the aroma of brewing tea, stale cigarette smoke, and the damp wool of rain-soaked coats. It was the kind of place where secrets could be whispered, where anonymity was a comforting cloak, and where the steady stream of travelers provided a constant, shifting backdrop. Rose arrived precisely at the appointed time, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She'd chosen a simple, dark gray dress and a close-fitting cloche hat, hoping to blend into the background, to become just another face in the crowd. But her nerves betrayed her. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed her gloves, and her eyes darted around the room, searching, yet dreading, what she might find. The tea room was moderately full. Soldiers on leave, their uniforms rumpled and stained, huddled in corners, nursing mugs of tea and sharing hushed conversations. Weary-looking women, their faces etched with worry, sat alone, staring out the rain-streaked windows, their thoughts undoubtedly miles away, on the battlefields of France. A few businessmen, their briefcases clutched tightly, discussed matters of commerce in low tones. No one seemed to pay her any particular attention. Rose chose a small table near the back, partially hidden by a tall potted fern. She ordered a pot of Earl Grey, her usual, a small comfort in this unfamiliar and unsettling situation. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a weary smile, took her order without comment, her movements practiced and efficient. As she waited, Rose replayed the contents of the letter in her mind, dissecting each sentence, searching for clues, for any hint of deception. Captain Thomas Sinclair. She tried to conjure an image of him, based solely on his handwriting and the few details he'd revealed. Strong, she imagined, but also sensitive, capable of both courage and compassion. A man who valued loyalty, who honored his promises, even in the face of death. A man who impossibly knew her. The tea arrived, steaming in a delicate porcelain pot. Rose poured herself a cup, the familiar ritual calming her nerves slightly. She added a splash of milk, no sugar, just as Edward had always preferred. The thought of her brother, of his unwavering belief in her, strengthened her resolve. She wouldn't let him down. She wouldn't let this unknown captain down. She sipped her tea, her gaze sweeping the room, searching for any sign, any indication of who she was supposed to meet. The letter had been vague on that point, simply instructing her to be present, to be observant. Was she to be approached? Or was she to make the first move? And how would she know who to trust? The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. The tea grew cold, her anxiety grew hotter. Doubts began to creep in. Was this a hoax? A cruel joke played on a grieving sister? Or worse, was it a trap? The letter had mentioned danger, spies, double agents. She had no experience in such matters. She was a nurse, a caregiver, not a player in some clandestine game. Just as she was about to give up, to flee back to the safety of her quiet life, a shadow fell across her table. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. A man stood before her, tall and imposing, his presence filling the small space. He was dressed in civilian clothes, a dark overcoat and a felt hat that concealed much of his face. But his eyes, visible beneath the brim of his hat, were what captured her attention. They were a startling shade of blue, intense and piercing, yet filled with a profound sadness, a weariness that spoke of battles fought and losses endured. He didn't speak, didn't smile. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on her, assessing her, searching for something. Rose met his gaze, her own fear momentarily forgotten in the face of his quiet intensity. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and husky, barely audible above the murmur of the tea room. "Miss Kensington?" It wasn't a question, but a statement, a confirmation. He knew who she was. Rose nodded, her voice caught in her throat. She managed a weak yes. He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down, his movements deliberate and controlled. He removed his hat, revealing a shock of dark, unruly hair, streaked with premature gray at the temples. His face was lean and angular, his features strong and well-defined, marked by a network of fine lines that spoke of hardship and exposure to the elements. He looked older than she'd expected, closer to 40 than 30, but there was a youthful intensity in his eyes that belied his age. "I am a friend of Captain Sinclair's," he said, his voice still low, his gaze never leaving hers. He didn't offer a name, and Rose didn't ask for one. It was clear that names were a luxury they couldn't afford. "He sent you the letter?" Rose asked, her voice trembling slightly. He nodded. "He did. He asked me to deliver it, to ensure your safety. He's alive?" The question escaped her lips before she could stop it, a desperate whisper of hope. The man hesitated, his blue eyes clouding with a deeper sadness. "He was when he wrote that letter. But things are uncertain. He's in a very dangerous situation." Rose felt a cold wave of disappointment wash over her. The flicker of hope that had ignited within her was extinguished, replaced by a renewed sense of dread. "What is this secret he spoke of?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did my brother entrust him with?" The man leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower. "It's not safe to discuss it here," he said. "Too many ears, too many eyes. We need to go somewhere more private." He glanced around the tea room, his gaze lingering on a few individuals, his expression unreadable. Rose felt a shiver of fear run down her spine. She was completely out of her depth, caught in a game she didn't understand, surrounded by potential enemies. "Where?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I have a safe house," he said. "Not far from here. We can talk there." He stood up, extending a hand to help her rise. Rose hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to run, to escape. But the look in his eyes, the echo of Captain Sinclair's trust, the memory of her brother, compelled her to take his hand. His grip was firm and reassuring, his hand surprisingly warm. As she stood, she felt a strange sense of connection to this unknown man, a shared sense of purpose, a shared burden. She was stepping into the unknown, into a world of shadows and secrets, but she was no longer alone. The whispers of a missing captain had led her to this, and she had no choice but to follow where they led. The rain was still falling as they left the tea room. Chapter 3. The unspoken promise in his eyes. The safe house was a nondescript, narrow building tucked away on a quiet side street, indistinguishable from its neighbors save for a slightly chipped paint job on the front door and a perpetually drawn curtain on the ground floor window. It was the kind of place that blended seamlessly into the urban landscape, a place where secrets could be kept, where anonymity was a shield. The man, who still hadn't offered his name, unlocked the door with a practiced ease, his movements quick and efficient. He ushered Rose inside, closing the door firmly behind them, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing in the sudden silence. The interior was dimly lit, the only source of light a single, low-wattage bulb hanging from the ceiling in the narrow hallway. The air was thick with the scent of dust and stale tobacco, a faint hint of something else, something metallic and sharp, that reminded Rose of the hospital, of antiseptic and blood. He led her down the hallway, past a series of closed doors, their purpose unknown. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath their feet and the distant rumble of London traffic. Rose felt a growing sense of unease, a prickling of fear at the back of her neck. She was completely isolated, alone with this stranger, in a place that felt both empty and strangely ominous. Finally, he stopped before a door at the end of the hallway. He unlocked it, pushing it open to reveal a small, sparsely furnished room. A single bed, a worn armchair, a small table, and a rickety wooden chair were the only pieces of furniture. A single window, covered by a heavy blackout curtain, offered no view of the outside world. The only source of light came from a small, oil lamp on the table, its flame casting flickering shadows across the walls. "We can talk here," he said, his voice still low, his gaze fixed on her. He gestured towards the armchair.
"Please sit down."
Rose hesitated for a moment, her instincts warring with her sense of obligation. She was trapped, in a way, but she also felt a strange sense of trust in this man, a trust that was rooted in Captain Sinclair's letter, in the unspoken promise in his eyes. She sat down in the armchair, the worn fabric rough beneath her fingers. He remained standing, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest, his posture both relaxed and watchful. Captain Sinclair's letter, Rose began, her voice trembling slightly. He said Edward entrusted him with a secret. A dangerous secret. The man nodded, his blue eyes darkening with a mixture of sadness and determination. He did. A secret that could change the course of the war. Rose felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of secret? He hesitated, his gaze shifting towards the window, as if searching for something in the darkness beyond. "It's complicated," he said finally. "It involves a network of spies, operating on both sides of the conflict. A network that Edward discovered, quite by accident." "Edward?" "But he was just a soldier. He was more than that, Miss Kensington," the man interrupted, his voice firm. "He was observant, intelligent, and he had a knack for languages. He stumbled upon something he shouldn't have, something that put him in grave danger." "What did he find?" Rose pressed, her fear growing with each revelation. "He intercepted a coded message," the man said. "A message that revealed the existence of a high-ranking British officer who was secretly working for the Germans. A traitor, feeding them vital information about our troop movements, our strategies, our weaknesses." Rose gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "A traitor? In the British Army?" The man nodded grimly. "It sounds unbelievable, I know. But Edward had proof. He had the decoded message, and he had identified the officer involved. And he gave this information to Captain Sinclair?" "Yes." He trusted Captain Sinclair implicitly. They had served together, become close friends. Sinclair was the only one Edward felt he could confide in. "But why me?" Rose asked, her voice filled with confusion. "Why did Captain Sinclair involve me?" The man's gaze softened slightly, a flicker of compassion in his eyes. "Because Edward made him promise," he said. "He made him promise that if anything happened to him, he would protect the information, and he would seek your help." "My help? But what can I possibly do?" "You have something that Captain Sinclair needs," the man said. "Something that Edward left in your possession, something that will help us expose the traitor." Rose frowned, trying to think. "I don't understand." Edward didn't leave anything with me, except his personal belongings, his letters. The man repeated, his eyes widening slightly. Did he ever mention anything unusual in his letters? Any coded messages, any hidden meanings? Rose thought back to Edward's letters, to the carefully worded phrases, the veiled references to his experiences at the front. She remembered one letter in particular, a letter that had struck her as odd at the time, a letter filled with seemingly random observations about the weather, the landscape, the names of the towns he passed through. There was one letter, she said slowly. It seemed different from the others. He described things in a way that didn't quite make sense, almost as if he was trying to tell me something without actually saying it. The man's eyes lit up with a spark of hope.
That's it, he said.
That's the key. Edward embedded the information in that letter, using a simple cipher, a code that only you would understand. But I don't know any ciphers, Rose protested. I wouldn't know where to begin. Captain Sinclair anticipated that, the man said. He left instructions. He said that you would know the key, that it was something personal, something only you and Edward shared. Rose racked her brain, trying to think of anything, any shared secret, any inside joke, any memory that could serve as a key. And then it came to her. A childhood game, a secret language they had invented, a way of communicating that no one else could understand. The flower code, she whispered, her voice filled with a sudden realization. The man smiled, a rare and fleeting expression that transformed his face. Yes, he said. The flower code. Captain Sinclair said you would remember. A wave of emotion washed over Rose, a mixture of grief for her brother, relief at finding the key, and a renewed sense of determination to fulfill his wishes. The unspoken promise in the man's eyes was now mirrored in her own. They were bound together by a shared secret, a shared mission, a shared love for a man who was lost, but whose legacy lived on. The silence stretched. She knew what she had to do. Chapter 4. Shadows in the London Fog. The Flower Code. It had been a silly, childish game, invented during long summer afternoons spent exploring the gardens of their country home. Edward, with his love of botany, had assigned each flower a corresponding letter of the alphabet, creating a whimsical, secret language that only they could decipher. Rose hadn't thought about it in years, had dismissed it as a forgotten relic of childhood. Yet, here it was, resurrected from the depths of memory, a vital key in a deadly game of espionage. Do you have the letter? The man asked, his voice pulling her back to the present, to the dimly lit room and the dangerous task that lay ahead. Rose nodded. Yes. It's at my flat. I can retrieve it. He considered this for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. It's risky, he said. We don't know who might be watching you. The traitor has eyes and ears everywhere. Rose felt a shiver of fear, but she pushed it aside. I have to do this, she said. For Edward. For Captain Sinclair. He met her gaze, his blue eyes searching hers, assessing her resolve. He saw the determination there, the unwavering commitment, and he nodded. All right, he said. But we need to be careful. We'll go together. I'll provide cover. He reached inside his coat, pulling out a small, but menacing-looking revolver. Rose gasped, her eyes widening in alarm. She'd never been this close to a weapon before, had only seen them from a distance, in the hands of the wounded soldiers at the hospital. Don't worry, he said, noticing her reaction. It's just a precaution. I don't intend to use it unless absolutely necessary. He tucked the revolver back inside his coat, but its presence served as a stark reminder of the danger they were facing. They were no longer dealing with whispers and letters, but with a ruthless enemy, a traitor who wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect his secrets. They left the safe house, stepping back out into the damp London night. The fog had thickened, swirling around them like a living entity, obscuring the streets, muffling the sounds of the city. It was the perfect cover for their clandestine mission, but it also added an element of unease, a sense of being watched, of being followed. The man, who Rose now thought of simply as Sinclair's friend, as a placeholder until a name was offered or no longer needed, walked close beside her, his hand hovering near his coat pocket, his senses on high alert. He scanned the streets, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign of danger. Rose kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the pavement, trying to control her racing heart. She felt exposed, vulnerable, a target in the crosshairs of an unseen enemy. But she also felt a strange sense of exhilaration, a thrill of adrenaline that she hadn't experienced before. She was stepping outside her carefully constructed shell, embracing a risk, a challenge, a purpose. They reached her flat without incident, the familiar sight of her building a small comfort in the swirling fog. Sinclair's friend waited outside, his back to the wall, his eyes constantly scanning the street, while Rose hurried inside. Her flat felt strangely alien, the familiar objects imbued with a new significance. She went straight to her desk, to the small wooden box where she kept Edward's letters. Her hands trembled as she opened the box, the scent of lavender and dried flowers, a scent that always reminded her of him, filling her nostrils. She found the letter quickly, its distinctive handwriting standing out from the others. It was dated several months before his death, and as she unfolded it, she remembered the confusion she'd felt when she'd first read it. It was filled with seemingly nonsensical descriptions of flowers, of gardens, of landscapes that didn't seem to correspond to his actual location. The roses are blooming crimson here, despite the gray skies. The lilies stand tall and proud, their white petals unblemished by the mud. The violets are hidden in the shadows, their delicate fragrance a secret treasure. Each flower, she now realized, represented a letter, a word, a piece of the puzzle. Using the flower code, she began to decipher the message, her heart pounding with anticipation. It was slow, painstaking work. The code was rusty in her memory, and she had to constantly refer to a small, handwritten notebook where she and Edward had recorded their secret language. But as she worked, the message began to emerge, a chilling revelation of betrayal and deceit. The name of the traitor was revealed, a high-ranking officer she recognized, a man who had been lauded as a hero, a man who had visited the hospital where she worked, his chest adorned with medals. The letter also contained details of his meetings with German agents, the information he had passed on, the devastating consequences of his treachery. Rose felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The scale of the betrayal was staggering, the implications horrific. She had to get this information to Sinclair's friend, to Captain Sinclair, to someone who could stop this madness. As she finished deciphering the letter, a sudden noise from outside startled her. A crash, followed by a muffled shout. She rushed to the window, her heart in her throat. Through the fog, she saw a struggle taking place on the street below. Sinclair's friend was grappling with two men, their faces obscured by the shadows. She saw the glint of a knife, heard a cry of pain. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand there and watch him die. Without thinking, she grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, her only weapon, and raced out of the flat, down the stairs, and into the fog-shrouded street. The scene before her sent ice through her veins. Chapter 5. A Rendezvous at the Wounded Knee. The scene that unfolded before Rose in the fog-laden street was a tableau of brutal, silent violence. Sinclair's friend was locked in a desperate struggle with two burly men, their dark clothes blending into the swirling mist, making them appear as monstrous, indistinct shapes. The glint of a knife blade flashed in the dim light, followed by a sickening thud and a muffled groan. Rose didn't hesitate. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline and a fierce, protective instinct she didn't know she possessed, she charged into the fray, wielding the heavy iron poker like a club. She swung it with all her might, aiming for the head of the man who held the knife, the man who was clearly about to deliver a fatal blow to Sinclair's friend. The poker connected with a sickening crunch, and the man crumpled to the ground, his knife clattering on the cobblestones. The other attacker, startled by her sudden appearance, turned towards her, his face contorted in a snarl. He lunged at her, his hands reaching for her throat. But Sinclair's friend, despite his injuries, was quicker. He tackled the man from behind, bringing him down with a heavy thud. The two men grappled on the ground, a tangle of limbs and grunts, while Rose stood over them, the poker raised, ready to strike again, if necessary. Finally, with a surge of strength, Sinclair's friend managed to subdue his attacker, pinning him to the ground, his arm twisted behind his back. He looked up at Rose, his face pale and drawn, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Get the letter," he managed to say, his voice strained. "Get to safety," Rose nodded, her heart still pounding in her chest. She knew they couldn't stay there. The attackers might have accomplices nearby, and the sound of the struggle was sure to attract attention. She helped Sinclair's friend to his feet. He was bleeding from a wound on his arm, the blood staining his coat a dark, ominous crimson. He leaned heavily on her, his weight almost too much for her to bear. "We need to get you to a doctor," she said, her voice filled with concern.
He shook his head.
No time. The letter, she knew he was right. The information in Edward's letter was too important, too dangerous to delay. But she couldn't just leave him to bleed to death. Then, she remembered. The hospital. The place where she volunteered, the place where she knew she could find help, a place where she might, just might, be able to blend in and buy them some time. "The Wounded Knee," she said, referring to the hospital's nickname, a grimly humorous reference to the endless stream of casualties it received. "We'll go to the Wounded Knee." He nodded, his face etched with pain. Lead the way. It was a slow, agonizing journey. Sinclair's friend could barely walk, and Rose had to support him almost entirely, her own strength flagging under his weight. The fog, which had initially provided cover, now seemed to hinder their progress, slowing them down, disorienting them. Every shadow seemed to conceal a potential threat, every sound made her jump. She was terrified, but she pushed her fear aside, focusing on getting them to safety, on fulfilling her promise to Edward, to Captain Sinclair. Finally, they reached the hospital. The familiar sight of the large, red brick building, with its brightly lit windows and the constant stream of ambulances arriving and departing, was a welcome relief. But Rose knew that they weren't safe yet. The hospital was a public place, and the trader's reach might extend even here. She guided Sinclair's friend through the back entrance, avoiding the main reception area, where they were more likely to be recognized. She led him down a maze of corridors, to a small, rarely used storage room, where she knew they could hide, at least temporarily. The room was filled with medical supplies, stacked in dusty boxes and shelves. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and bandages, a familiar smell that usually comforted her, but now only heightened her anxiety. She helped Sinclair's friend to sit down on a stack of blankets, his face ashen, his breathing shallow. She examined his wound. It was deep, and it was still bleeding profusely. She needed to stop the bleeding, to clean the wound, to bandage it. She found a first aid kit, and with practiced hands, she began to tend to his injuries. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic, wincing at his pained hiss, then applied pressure to stop the bleeding. She bandaged it tightly, using strips of linen torn from a discarded sheet. As she worked, she couldn't help but notice the details of his face, the lines of pain and exhaustion etched around his eyes, the stubble of his beard, the way his dark hair curled damply against his forehead. She realized that she still didn't know his name, that she knew nothing about him, except that he was Captain Sinclair's friend, and that he was risking his life to protect a secret, to honor a promise. "Thank you," he said, his voice weak but sincere. He met her gaze, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that made her heart skip a beat. Rose felt a blush creep up her cheeks. She averted her gaze, focusing on her task. "We need to get you to a doctor," she repeated. "A proper doctor." He shook his head.
"No.
Not yet. We need to get the letter to the right hands." He reached inside his coat, his movements slow and painful. He pulled out a small, sealed envelope, stained with his blood. "This," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is for Captain Sinclair. You must deliver it." Rose took the envelope, her fingers brushing against his. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through her, a strange, unexpected sensation that left her breathless. She looked at him, at his pale face, his wounded eyes, and she knew that she couldn't refuse him. She would deliver the letter. She would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. He closed his eyes for a moment, his face contorting in a silent grimace of pain. Then, in a very low voice, he said one more word: run. Chapter 6. Scars that tell a silent story. The word run hung in the air, a stark, chilling imperative in the dimly lit storage room. Rose stared at Sinclair's friend, his eyes now closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. The bloodstain on his coat continued to spread, a dark, ominous reminder of the danger they were in. She knew he was right. She had to leave, to get the letter to safety, to find someone who could help. But the thought of leaving him there, wounded and vulnerable, was unbearable. She looked around the storage room, her mind racing, searching for a solution. She couldn't take him with her, not in his condition. And she couldn't trust anyone at the hospital, not yet. The traitor's influence might extend further than she realized. Then she remembered. Nurse Davies. A gruff, no-nonsense woman with a heart of gold. A woman who had been at the hospital for years. A woman who had seen it all. A woman who could be trusted. Rose made a decision. She would leave Sinclair's friend in the storage room, hidden among the medical supplies, while she went to find Nurse Davies. She would tell her everything, enlist her help, and together they would find a way to protect him, to get the letter to the right hands. She gently touched his arm, his skin surprisingly warm beneath her fingers. "I'll be back," she whispered. "I promise. I'll get help." He didn't respond. His eyes remained closed, but she saw a slight tightening of his jaw, a flicker of awareness in his face. She hoped he understood, that he trusted her. She stood up, her legs trembling slightly. She took one last look at him, at his pale face, his wounded body, and she felt a surge of determination, a fierce resolve to protect him, to see this through to the end. She slipped out of the storage room, closing the door quietly behind her. She navigated the familiar corridors of the hospital, her senses on high alert, her eyes scanning for any sign of danger. She found Nurse Davies in the nurse's station, her usual domain, a small, cluttered room filled with charts, medication, and the constant hum of activity. She was a large, imposing woman, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and a stern expression that could intimidate even the most hardened soldier. But Rose knew that beneath that gruff exterior lay a compassionate heart, a fierce loyalty to her patients, and an unwavering sense of duty. Rose took a deep breath and approached her, her voice low and urgent. "Nurse Davies," she said, "I need your help. It's a matter of life and death." Nurse Davies looked up from her paperwork, her sharp eyes assessing Rose's disheveled appearance, her pale face, her trembling hands. She saw the fear in her eyes, the urgency in her voice, and she knew that something was terribly wrong. "What is it, Kensington?" she asked, her voice gruff, but concerned. Rose hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to reveal, how much to trust. But she knew she had no choice. She had to trust someone, and Nurse Davies was her only hope. She quickly recounted the events of the past few hours, the letter, the attack, Sinclair's friend, the secret that could change the course of the war. She spoke in a low, hurried whisper, glancing around the room to make sure they weren't overheard. Nurse Davies listened intently, her expression unchanging, her eyes fixed on Rose's face. When Rose finished, she didn't speak for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. "Show me," she said finally, her voice firm. Rose led her back to the storage room, her heart pounding with anxiety. She opened the door, and Nurse Davies stepped inside, her gaze immediately falling on Sinclair's friend, lying unconscious on the stack of blankets. She knelt beside him, her movements quick and efficient. She examined his wound, her fingers probing gently, her expression grim.
"He needs a doctor," she said.
"And he needs to be moved somewhere safer. This place is too exposed." Rose nodded, her relief at Nurse Davies' willingness to help overwhelming. "I know," she said. "But where can we take him? We can't trust anyone." Nurse Davies thought for a moment, her eyes scanning the room, as if searching for inspiration. "I have a place," she said finally. "My brother's farm. It's outside London, secluded, safe. We can take him there." "But how will we get him there?" Rose asked. He can't walk, and we can't use an ambulance. It's too risky. Nurse Davies smiled, a rare and fleeting expression that transformed her face.
I have my ways, she said.
Leave it to me. And she did. With a combination of cunning, determination, and a network of contacts she had cultivated over years of service, Nurse Davies managed to arrange for a discreet, unmarked van to transport Sinclair's friend to her brother's farm. She procured medical supplies, medication, everything they needed to care for him. Rose watched in amazement as Nurse Davies orchestrated the operation, her gruff exterior concealing a resourceful and compassionate soul. She realized that she had underestimated this woman, that beneath the stern facade lay a hidden depth, a strength that was both inspiring and reassuring. They hid him under blankets, after smuggling a stretcher out a side door. As they prepared to leave, Rose took one last look at Sinclair's friend, his face pale and still in the dim light of the van. She gently touched his hand, her fingers lingering on his skin. She felt a connection to him, a bond forged in danger, in shared secrets, in unspoken promises. A promise she would not break. The scars on his hand, she noticed, were old, telling a silent story of a past she couldn't fathom. And yet she knew. She knew. Chapter 7. The Cipher of the Heart. The journey to Nurse Davies' brother's farm was a tense, silent affair. The unmarked van, driven by a taciturn man who Nurse Davies introduced only as George, bumped along the dark, country roads, its headlights cutting through the thick fog that blanketed the landscape. Rose sat in the back, beside Sinclair's friend, his unconscious form strapped to a makeshift stretcher. She monitored his breathing, his pulse, her anxiety growing with each passing mile. Nurse Davies sat in the front passenger seat, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. She spoke only when necessary, giving George curt directions, her voice betraying no hint of the danger they were in, the risk they were taking. Rose felt a growing sense of isolation, of being cut off from the world, from her familiar life. She was hurtling through the darkness, towards an unknown destination, with a wounded stranger and a woman she barely knew, her only connection to reality the steady rhythm of Sinclair's friend's breathing, the faint warmth of his body beside hers. She thought about Captain Sinclair, the man who had started this chain of events, the man who was still missing somewhere in the war-torn landscape of France. She wondered if he was alive, if he knew the danger his friend was in, if he knew the role she was playing in this desperate game of espionage. She thought about Edward, her brother, the gentle soul who had stumbled upon a secret that had cost him his life. She felt a renewed surge of grief, but also a sense of purpose, a determination to see his mission through, to expose the traitor, to avenge his death. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the van slowed to a halt. George turned off the headlights, and they were plunged into complete darkness. Rose heard the sound of a gate creaking open, then the van lurched forward, bumping along a rough, unpaved track. "We're here," Nurse Davies announced, her voice low and steady. The van stopped, and George cut the engine. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant hooting of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the wind. They had arrived at the farm. It was a small, isolated holding, nestled in a valley, surrounded by rolling hills and dense woodland. The farmhouse itself was a modest, two-story building made of stone, with a thatched roof and small, leaded windows. A single light flickered in one of the downstairs windows, casting a warm, inviting glow. Nurse Davies' brother, a gruff, weathered man named Thomas, greeted them at the door, his expression wary but welcoming. He helped them carry Sinclair's friend inside, laying him gently on a bed in a small, ground-floor room. The room was sparsely furnished, but clean and comfortable. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the walls, chasing away the chill of the night. Rose felt a sense of relief, of having reached a safe haven, a place where they could rest, regroup, and plan their next move. Nurse Davies quickly set about tending to Sinclair's friend's injuries, her movements practiced and efficient. She cleaned and rebandaged his wound, administered medication, and made him as comfortable as possible. Rose watched her, her admiration for this woman growing with each passing moment. She was a force of nature, a woman who defied expectations, who embodied both strength and compassion, a woman who was willing to risk everything to help a stranger, to uphold a principle. While Nurse Davies cared for the man, Thomas showed Rose to a small room upstairs. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the farmyard. "Get some rest," Thomas said, his voice gruff but kind. "You'll need it." Rose nodded, exhaustion washing over her. She hadn't slept in over 24 hours, and the stress and adrenaline of the past few days had taken their toll. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was racing, replaying the events of the past few days, the faces, the words, the dangers. She thought about Sinclair's friend, lying unconscious downstairs, his life hanging in the balance. She wondered who he was, what his story was, what had led him to this point. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the blood-stained envelope he had given her, the envelope containing Captain Sinclair's message. She had to deliver it, but to whom?
And how?
She remembered the words of the letter that had started it all. "Edward believed in you. He trusted you implicitly. And in this darkness, his trust is the only beacon I have left." Edward's trust. That was her guide, her compass, her driving force. She would find a way. She would decipher the cipher of her own heart, the fears, the hesitations, the longing for a connection she had denied herself for so long. She sat down on the bed, the envelope in her hand. She opened it, unfolding the single sheet of paper. The message was written in Captain Sinclair's firm, masculine hand, the same handwriting she had seen on the first letter. But this message was different. It was shorter, more cryptic, more urgent. "The clock is ticking. The eagle has flown. Find the nest. Trust the rose." The words were a puzzle, a riddle, a code within a code. Rose stared at them, her mind struggling to make sense of them. The clock is ticking. That was clear enough. Time was running out. The eagle has flown. That must refer to the traitor, the high-ranking officer who was working for the Germans. He had escaped, gone to ground. Find the nest. That must be his hiding place, his base of operations. But the last phrase, "trust the rose," that was the most puzzling of all. What did it mean? Who was the rose? Was it her? Was it a code name for someone else? Or was it literal? Rose racked her brain for any hint, and a feeling began to creep inside her. It wasn't a what. It was a who. And the who was her. She was the rose. She sat up, her eyes widening. And then a horrible thought, a new fear came over her. Could it be her? The idea crept slowly and spread. Chapter 8. Betrayal in the ranks. The creeping fear that she might somehow be unknowingly involved, that she was the rose in a way she didn't understand, took root in Rose's mind and blossomed into a thorny, agonizing doubt. Could she be unwittingly aiding the enemy? Had Edward, in his coded message, inadvertently implicated her? The thought was preposterous, yet the words of Captain Sinclair's message "trust the rose" echoed in her mind, taking on a sinister, ambiguous meaning. She paced the small room, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and anxiety. She examined every interaction, every conversation, every detail of the past few days, searching for any clue, any hint of deception, any indication that she might be playing a role she wasn't aware of. The idea that she could be a traitor, even an unwitting one, was abhorrent to her. She had dedicated her life to helping others, to alleviating suffering, to upholding the values of loyalty and compassion. The very notion that she might be contributing to the war effort of the enemy, that she might be responsible for the deaths of British soldiers, was unbearable. She thought about Sinclair's friend, lying unconscious downstairs. Had he suspected her? Was that why he had been so guarded, so reluctant to reveal his name, his purpose? Was he testing her, watching her, waiting for her to betray herself? The more she thought about it, the more plausible it seemed. The letter, the meeting at the tea room, the attack, the escape to the hospital, The journey to the farm, it all could have been a carefully orchestrated charade, designed to expose her, to trap her. She remembered the way he had looked at her, his intense blue eyes searching hers, as if trying to decipher her secrets, to assess her trustworthiness. She had interpreted it as concern, as gratitude, as a shared sense of purpose. But now, she wondered if it had been something else entirely. Suspicion. Accusation. She sank onto the bed, her head in her hands, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and despair. She was trapped, caught in a web of intrigue and deception, with no one to trust, no one to turn to. Then, a flicker of defiance ignited within her. She wouldn't succumb to fear. She wouldn't let doubt paralyze her. She would prove her innocence. She would find the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how dangerous. She stood up, her resolve hardening. She would start with the letter, with Captain Sinclair's cryptic message. The clock is ticking. The eagle has flown. Find the nest. Trust the rose. She focused on the phrase, find the nest. That was the key. She had to find the traitor's hiding place, his base of operations.
But how?
She remembered Edward's letter, the one she had deciphered using the flower code. It had contained the name of the traitor and details of his meetings with German agents. But it hadn't revealed his current location. Then she remembered something else. A small detail, a seemingly insignificant observation that Edward had included in his letter. He had mentioned a specific landmark, a place near where one of the meetings had taken place. A church. St. Michael's. Bombed out, but still standing. Rose grabbed a piece of paper and a pencil from the washstand. She began to sketch a map, based on her memory of Edward's letter and her knowledge of London. She marked the location of St. Michael's Church, and then she started to add other landmarks, other potential hiding places. As she worked, a plan began to form in her mind. She would go to St. Michael's. She would search for clues, for any sign of the traitor's presence. It was risky, dangerous, but she had no other choice. She glanced at the window. The first rays of dawn were beginning to appear, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gray. She had to move quickly. She folded the map and tucked it into her pocket. She took one last look around the room, as if memorizing its details, then she slipped out the door and crept downstairs. She found Nurse Davies in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. She looked tired, but her expression was determined. "I'm going out," Rose said, her voice low and steady. Nurse Davies looked up, her eyebrows raised in surprise. "Where are you going?" Rose hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. She couldn't tell Nurse Davies the truth, not yet. She didn't know who she could trust. I need to get some fresh air," she said, improvising. "I need to clear my head." Nurse Davies studied her for a moment, her sharp eyes assessing her. She saw the determination in Rose's face, the resolve in her eyes, and she didn't press her further. "Be careful," she said. "And don't be gone too long." Rose nodded. She slipped out the back door, into the cool morning air. The fog had lifted, revealing a crisp, clear day. She walked quickly, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She had a mission, a purpose, a desperate hope that she could find the truth, that she could clear her name, that she could stop the traitor before it was too late. As she walked, a glint of metal caught her eye. Partially hidden beneath a bush, a discarded insignia pin lay on the ground. The symbol on it was a soaring eagle. Chapter 9. Echoes of gunfire and whispers. The eagle insignia pin, glinting in the early morning light, sent a jolt of fear and recognition through Rose. It was the same symbol she had seen described in Edward's deciphered letter, the mark of the traitorous officer. Its presence here, at Nurse Davies' brother's farm, was a chilling confirmation of her worst fears. The safe haven was anything but. The enemy was closer than she had imagined, perhaps even within the walls of the farmhouse itself. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of this new, terrifying development. Was Nurse Davies involved? Was her brother, Thomas, part of the conspiracy? Or were they unwitting pawns, manipulated by the traitor, just as she had been? She picked up the pin, her fingers trembling. It was cold and heavy in her hand, a tangible representation of the betrayal that surrounded her. She examined it closely, noting the intricate details of the design, the sharp talons of the eagle, the cruel curve of its beak. She had to get away, to warn Sinclair's friend, to find someone she could trust. But who?
And how?
She was isolated, surrounded by potential enemies, with no means of communication, no way to escape. She slipped the pin into her pocket, her mind working furiously. She couldn't go back to the farmhouse, not yet. She had to find out more, to gather evidence, to understand the extent of the conspiracy. She decided to continue with her original plan, to go to St. Michael's Church. It was a long shot, but it was her only lead. Perhaps she could find something there, some clue that would help her expose the traitor, that would clear her name. She walked quickly, keeping to the edges of the fields, avoiding the main road. The countryside was quiet and peaceful, the birds singing in the trees, the sun warming her skin. But the beauty of the landscape couldn't mask the fear that gnawed at her, the sense of being hunted, of being watched. It took her several hours to reach London, her legs aching, her body exhausted. She arrived at St. Michael's Church, a bombed-out shell of a building, its roof gone, its walls scarred by shrapnel, its windows gaping like empty eyes. The church was located in a desolate part of the city, an area that had been heavily bombed during the early days of the war. The surrounding buildings were also in ruins, their facades crumbling, their interiors exposed to the elements. It was a place of ghosts, of memories, of shattered lives. Rose cautiously approached the church, her senses on high alert. She scanned the area, searching for any sign of activity, any indication that she was being followed. She slipped inside the church, through a gaping hole in the wall. The interior was a scene of devastation. The altar was shattered, the pews overturned, the floor covered in rubble and debris. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, a faint hint of something else, something metallic and sharp, that reminded her of the safe house, of blood and gunpowder. She began to search, her eyes scanning every corner, every crevice, every shadow. She found nothing, just rubble, dust, and the echoes of past prayers, past lives. Then she noticed something, a small, almost imperceptible disturbance in the dust on the floor, near what had once been the altar. It looked like footprints, faint but distinct, leading towards a small, side chapel. She followed the footprints, her heart pounding with anticipation. She reached the chapel, its entrance partially blocked by fallen masonry. She squeezed through the opening, her breath catching in her throat. The chapel was small and dark, its only source of light a narrow, stained glass window that had miraculously survived the bombing. The window depicted a scene of St. Michael slaying a dragon, its colors vibrant and luminous, casting a kaleidoscope of light across the room. And in the center of the room, on a makeshift table made of salvaged wood, she saw it. A radio transmitter. A sophisticated piece of equipment, capable of sending and receiving coded messages. She had found the nest. She approached the transmitter, her mind racing. She examined it closely, noting the dials, the switches, the antenna. She didn't know how to operate it, but she knew what it was, what it meant. She heard a noise behind her, a footstep on the rubble. She whirled around, her heart in her throat. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the light. A figure she recognized. Sinclair's friend. He was standing, albeit unsteadily, his face pale and drawn, his arm in a sling. But his eyes were clear, alert, and filled with a mixture of surprise and something else. Something that made her blood run cold. "You," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I should have known." Rose stared at him, her mind reeling. "You're the traitor?" He smiled, a cruel, chilling smile that transformed his face. "Not the traitor, Miss Kensington," he corrected, "but a traitor. There are many of us. And you, my dear, have been most helpful." He took a slow step closer. The echoes of distant gunfire seemed much, much closer now. Chapter 10. The Dance of Deception and Desire. The revelation that Sinclair's friend, the man she had trusted, the man she had cared for, The man who had carried Captain Sinclair's message was a traitor, hit Rose with the force of a physical blow. Her legs weakened, her breath caught in her throat, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. All the pieces of the puzzle, the inconsistencies, the unanswered questions, now fell into place, forming a horrifying picture of betrayal and deceit.
But why?
Rose stammered, her voice trembling. Why would you do this? Why would you betray your country, your friends, your Captain Sinclair? He chuckled, a cold, humorless sound that echoed in the ruined chapel. Captain Sinclair, he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. A naive fool, a sentimental idealist. He believed in honor, in duty, in all the meaningless platitudes that this war has exposed as lies. And you don't? Rose challenged, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a surge of anger and indignation. I believe in survival, he said, his eyes hardening. In power. In winning. And I will do whatever it takes to achieve those goals. Even if it means betraying everything I once held dear. He took another step closer, his presence looming over her, his shadow falling across the radio transmitter. You were a useful pawn, Miss Kensington, he said. Your connection to Edward, your naivete, your willingness to trust it all made you the perfect tool. I helped you, Rose said, her voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and self-reproach. I cared for you. I risked my life for you. He smiled, a cruel, mocking smile. And I appreciate your efforts, he said. They were most entertaining. But now, your usefulness has come to an end. He reached inside his coat, pulling out the revolver he had shown her before. Rose gasped, her eyes widening in terror. She was trapped, cornered, facing a ruthless enemy who wouldn't hesitate to kill her. But then, something unexpected happened. As he raised the revolver, his hand trembled slightly, his eyes flickered with a hint of hesitation. Doubt? Rose saw it, a fleeting moment of vulnerability, a crack in his carefully constructed facade of cruelty. And in that moment, she realized that he wasn't as cold-blooded as he pretended to be. There was still something human beneath the layers of betrayal and deceit, something that resonated with the unspoken connection they had shared, the bond forged in danger, in shared secrets, in the flickering candlelight of a hidden room. You don't want to do this, Rose said, her voice firm, her gaze locked on his. I know you don't. There's still good in you. I saw it. I felt it. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger, his eyes searching hers. He saw the sincerity in her face, the unwavering belief in her eyes, and it seemed to shake him, to challenge his resolve. Don't be foolish, Miss Kensington, he said, his voice losing some of its menace. There's no turning back. I've gone too far. It's never too late, Rose insisted. You can still choose the right side. You can still redeem yourself. He lowered the revolver slightly, his expression conflicted, his internal struggle visible in the lines of his face, the tension in his body. Rose saw her chance. She took a step closer, her hand reaching out towards him, her touch gentle, tentative. Let me help you, she said. We can do this together. We can expose the others. We can stop this madness. He stared at her hand, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and despair. He wanted to believe her. She could see it, but the fear, the ingrained loyalty to his cause, the weight of his past actions, held him back. The silence stretched between them, a tense, fragile moment of possibility, of choice. The fate of two nations, the lives of countless individuals, hung in the balance. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, he lowered the revolver completely. He looked at Rose, his eyes filled with a profound sadness, a deep regret. I can't, he said, his voice barely a whisper.
I'm trapped.
They have something on me. Something that would destroy me. What is it? Rose asked, her voice filled with urgency.
Tell me.
We can find a way to deal with it. He hesitated, his gaze shifting towards the window, as if searching for an escape, for a way out of the trap he had built for himself. It's a woman, he said finally, his voice choked with emotion. Someone I cared for. They threatened to hurt her. If I didn't cooperate. Rose felt a surge of empathy, of understanding. She knew what it was like to love someone, to fear for their safety, to be willing to do anything to protect them. Before she could offer any words of comfort, a sudden crash from outside the chapel shattered the fragile moment. Voices shouted, footsteps pounded on the rubble. "They're here," he said, his eyes widening in alarm. "They know." He grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "We have to go," he said.
Now.
He pulled her towards a hidden door, a secret exit she hadn't noticed before. A dance had started. Chapter 11. A love forged in the crucible of war. He pulled her through the hidden door, a narrow passage concealed behind a crumbling section of wall, and into a maze of tunnels beneath the church. The air was damp and cold, the darkness almost complete, broken only by the faint glimmer of light filtering through cracks in the walls above. The sounds of the pursuers echoed behind them, their shouts and footsteps growing closer, fueling their desperate flight. Rose stumbled along, her hand clasped tightly in his, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know where they were going, where these tunnels led, but she trusted him, despite everything, despite his betrayal, despite the danger they were in. She trusted the flicker of humanity she had seen in his eyes, the unspoken connection that had bound them together, the shared vulnerability that had been revealed in the crucible of their confrontation. He, in turn, seemed to draw strength from her presence, her unwavering belief in him, her willingness to offer him a second chance. He moved with a newfound determination, his step surer, his grip on her hand firmer. They ran through the darkness, their breaths mingling in the confined space, their bodies brushing against each other, a strange, intimate dance in the midst of chaos and fear. Rose felt a connection to him, a bond that transcended the circumstances, the lies, the betrayals. It was a love forged in the crucible of war, a love born of shared danger, of shared secrets, of a shared yearning for redemption. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the end of the tunnel. He pushed open a heavy wooden door, and they emerged into a narrow, deserted alleyway, the daylight blinding after the darkness of the tunnels. They were still in London, but far from St. Michael's Church, in a part of the city Rose didn't recognize. They were safe for the moment, but they knew they couldn't stay there. Their pursuers would be searching for them, and they had to find a way to disappear, to escape the clutches of the traitorous network. He looked at Rose, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and desperation. "Thank you," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "for believing in me, for giving me another chance." Rose met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions: fear, anger, confusion, but also love. A love that was unexpected, forbidden, perhaps even foolish, but undeniably real. "We're in this together now," she said, her voice firm. "We have to find a way to stop them."
To expose them.
He nodded, his resolve hardening. "I know," he said. "And I know who can help us." He told her about a contact he had, a man within British intelligence, a man who had been suspicious of the traitorous officer for some time, but had lacked the evidence to act. This man, he believed, could be trusted, could provide them with the protection and the resources they needed to bring down the network. But reaching this contact would be dangerous, risky. They would have to navigate the treacherous streets of London, avoid the eyes of the enemy, and somehow make contact without being detected. They decided to split up, to make it harder for their pursuers to track them. They agreed on a rendezvous point, a small, obscure cafe near the docks, a place where they could meet in secret. Rose watched him go, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and longing. She didn't know if she would ever see him again, if they would survive this ordeal, if their fragile, newly formed love would have a chance to blossom. She turned and walked in the opposite direction, her mind racing, her senses on high alert. She had to reach the rendezvous point, to deliver her message, to play her part in this dangerous game. As she walked, she thought about the words of Captain Sinclair's letter. Trust the rose. She had finally understood their meaning. She was the rose, the symbol of hope, of resilience, of the enduring power of love in the face of adversity. She was the rose, and she would not wilt. She would bloom, even in the darkness, even in the midst of war. She would fight for her love, for her country, for a future free from betrayal and deceit. She would prevail for Edward, for Captain Sinclair, and most of all, for the man she had found herself falling for, against all reason. She felt a strange mix of emotions, a conflict inside. But she knew her path. Chapter 12. The Price of Loyalty. The rendezvous point, a small, dingy cafe called the Salty Siren, was nestled among the warehouses and wharves of the London docks. The air was thick with the smell of salt, fish, and tar, the sounds of creaking ships and shouting dockworkers filling the air. It was a place of anonymity, of transient encounters, of whispered secrets, the perfect place for a clandestine meeting. Rose arrived at the cafe, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. She chose a table in a dark corner, her back to the wall, her eyes constantly scanning the room. She ordered a cup of tea, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted it to her lips. The cafe was sparsely populated, a few sailors, dockworkers, and a couple of women with weary eyes and painted smiles. No one seemed to pay her any particular attention. She waited, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. She replayed the events of the past few hours, the revelation of Sinclair's friend's betrayal, their escape from the church, their desperate flight through the tunnels. She wondered if he had made it, if he had managed to evade their pursuers, if he would be able to contact his friend in British intelligence. She thought about the love that had blossomed between them, a love that was as unexpected as it was intense, a love that had been forged in the crucible of danger and shared secrets. She wondered if it was real, if it could survive the trials that lay ahead, if it was worth fighting for. Just as she was about to give up hope, the door to the cafe opened, and he walked in. He looked exhausted, his clothes disheveled, his face pale and drawn. But his eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a relief and a tenderness that sent a warmth through her heart. He sat down opposite her, his gaze sweeping the room, assessing the potential threats. He leaned closer, his voice low and urgent. "Did you make contact?" Rose asked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded. "I did. He's on his way. He said he'd be here within the hour." "And the others? Did they follow you?" He shook his head. "I don't think so. I took precautions. I think we lost them." They fell silent, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. They were fugitives, hunted by a powerful and ruthless enemy, their lives hanging in the balance. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was warm and reassuring, a silent expression of the bond that had formed between them. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice filled with regret. "For everything. For deceiving you. For putting you in danger." Rose met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions.
"It's not your fault," she said.
"You were trapped. You were forced to do things you didn't want to do."
"But I still did them," he said.
"And I can never forgive myself for that." "We all make mistakes," Rose said. "We all have regrets. What matters is what we do now, how we choose to move forward." He squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with gratitude.
"Thank you," he said, "for understanding.
For giving me a chance." They sat in silence for a few moments, their hands clasped together, their hearts beating in unison. The world outside the cafe, the war, the danger, the uncertainty, seemed to fade away, replaced by a fragile, intimate connection, a shared hope for a better future. Then, the door to the cafe opened again, and a man walked in. He was tall and imposing, with a stern face and piercing eyes. He wore a dark suit and a bowler hat, and he carried himself with an air of authority. Rose and Sinclair's friend both recognized him instantly. It was Major Alistair Finch, the man from British intelligence, the man who could help them. Major Finch approached their table, his gaze sweeping over them, assessing them. He sat down, his expression unreadable. "You're him," Sinclair's friend said, his voice hesitant. "The contact." Major Finch nodded. "I am." "And you are?" Sinclair's friend hesitated. Then he spoke his name for the first time.
"Thomas," he said.
"Thomas Ashworth." Rose felt a jolt of surprise. He had finally revealed his name, a sign of trust, a symbol of his commitment to a new path. Major Finch turned to Rose. "And you, miss?"
Rose Kensington, she said.
"I was involved through my brother, Edward Kensington." Major Finch's eyes widened slightly. "Edward Kensington," he repeated. "Yes, I know of him. A brave man. He uncovered valuable information." "He was murdered," Rose said, her voice filled with pain. "By the traitor he exposed." Major Finch nodded grimly. "We know. And we intend to bring that traitor to justice. And all those who aided and abetted him." He looked at Thomas, his gaze intense. "You have information for me, Mr. Ashworth?" Thomas nodded. "I do. I know the identity of several members of the network. I know their methods, their meeting places, their plans." He began to speak, recounting everything he knew, the details of the conspiracy, the names of the traitors, the devastating impact of their actions. Rose listened intently, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. As Thomas spoke, Major Finch took notes, his expression growing increasingly grim. He asked questions, probing for details, clarifying points. Finally, Thomas finished. He looked at Major Finch, his eyes filled with a desperate plea.
"You have to stop them," he said.
"Before it's too late." Major Finch nodded. "We will, Mr. Ashworth," he said. "I promise you. We will." But then, he added, his voice hardening, "But you understand, Mr. Ashworth, that you are also implicated in this. You are a part of this network. You committed acts of treason." Thomas paled, his eyes widening in fear. "I know," he said. "But I was forced to. They threatened someone I cared about." Major Finch's expression softened slightly. "I understand," he said. "And that will be taken into consideration. But you will still have to answer for your actions." Rose felt a surge of fear for Thomas. She knew that he had done terrible things, but she also knew that he had been coerced, that he had risked his life to help them, that he was trying to redeem himself. He had paid the price. Would he now pay again? Chapter 13. Letters from a Ghost. Major Finch's words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the consequences Thomas faced, despite his change of heart and his willingness to cooperate. The price of loyalty, once misplaced, was steep, and the shadow of his past actions loomed large. Rose looked at Thomas, her heart aching for him. She saw the fear in his eyes, the resignation, the acceptance of his fate. But she also saw something else, a flicker of hope, a stubborn refusal to be completely defeated. "Major Finch," Rose said, her voice firm and clear, "Thomas has risked his life to help us. He has provided you with invaluable information. He has betrayed his former allies at great personal risk. Surely that counts for something." Major Finch regarded her, his expression unreadable. "It does, Miss Kensington," he said. "But it doesn't absolve him of his crimes. Treason is a serious offense, especially during wartime." "But he was coerced," Rose insisted.
"He was threatened."
"He was forced to choose between his loyalty to his country and the life of someone he loved." Major Finch sighed, his gaze shifting to Thomas. "Mr. Ashworth," he said, "tell me about this person. The one they threatened." Thomas hesitated, his eyes flickering with a mixture of pain and reluctance. "Her name is Eliza," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She works as a codebreaker at Bletchley Park. She's brilliant, dedicated, completely unaware of my involvement with the enemy." Rose's eyes widened in surprise. A codebreaker? That was a crucial role, a position of immense trust and responsibility. No wonder the traitorous network had targeted her. She was the perfect leverage against Thomas. "They threatened to expose her," Thomas continued, his voice choked with emotion.
"To frame her as a spy.
To ruin her career, her life, her reputation. I couldn't let that happen." Major Finch listened intently, his expression softening slightly. He understood the agonizing dilemma Thomas had faced, the impossible choice he had been forced to make. "We'll protect her, Mr. Ashworth," Major Finch said. "I give you my word. We'll ensure her safety, and we'll make sure she's not implicated in any of this." Thomas looked at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. "Thank you." Major Finch turned to Rose. Miss Kensington, he said, you mentioned your brother, Edward. He left something with you, I believe. Something that could be of use to us. Rose nodded.
Yes, she said.
His letters. He used a code, a secret language we invented as children, to embed information about the traitorous officer. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter she had deciphered, the one that had revealed the identity of the traitor and the details of his meetings with German agents. She handed it to Major Finch. He examined it carefully, his eyes scanning the seemingly innocuous words, the hidden message concealed within. This is remarkable, he said. Your brother was a very clever man. He was, Rose said, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Major Finch folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. This will be invaluable, he said. It provides concrete evidence, corroborating Mr. Ashworth's testimony. It will help us build a case against the traitors. He stood up, his expression determined. We have a lot of work to do, he said. We need to move quickly, before they realize we're on to them. He turned to Thomas. Mr. Ashworth, you'll come with me. We'll need your continued cooperation. We'll provide you with protection, and we'll do everything we can to mitigate the consequences of your actions. Thomas nodded, his expression resigned but resolute. He stood up, ready to face his fate, to atone for his past mistakes. He looked at Rose, his eyes filled with a deep, unspoken emotion. Thank you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. For everything. Rose met his gaze, her own eyes filled with tears. Be safe, she said. And good luck. They watched as Major Finch and Thomas left the cafe, disappearing into the bustling streets of London. Rose felt a profound sense of loss, of uncertainty, of fear for Thomas's future. But she also felt a sense of hope, of determination, of a belief that justice would prevail, that the sacrifices they had made would not be in vain. She sat alone at the table, the remnants of their meeting, the empty teacups, the lingering scent of tobacco, the echoes of their whispered conversations surrounding her. She felt drained, exhausted, but also strangely exhilarated. She had played her part. She had fulfilled her promise to Edward. She had helped to expose a dangerous conspiracy. She reached into her pocket and pulled out another letter, a letter she had received a few days before, a letter that had been forwarded to her from the War Office. It was a letter from Captain Sinclair, a letter written before he had gone missing, a letter that had somehow found its way to her. She unfolded the letter, her hands trembling slightly. She recognized his handwriting, the firm, masculine script that had first drawn her into this dangerous world. My dearest Rose, I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I have to write it. I have to tell you that I've fallen in love with you. I know it's impossible, absurd, given the circumstances, given that we've never met. But I've seen your photograph, I've heard your brother speak of you, and I feel a connection to you, a bond that transcends distance, time, and even war. Rose's heart ached as she read the words of a ghost, a man who might be dead, a man who had loved her from afar, a man who had set in motion the events that had changed her life forever. She continued reading, her tears blurring the ink. If I survive this war, I will find you. I will seek you out. And I will tell you to your face what I can only write in this letter. I love you, Rose Kensington. And I believe, somehow, that you might love me too. Rose closed the letter, her heart breaking. She would never know if Captain Sinclair had survived, if he had ever had the chance to fulfill his promise. But she knew, with a certainty that defied logic and reason, that she loved him too. A love that had been born in the shadows of war, a love that had blossomed in the midst of danger and deceit, a love that would endure, even in the face of loss and uncertainty. The letters, all arrayed before her. Which one to read next? Chapter 14. The Midnight Confession. The weight of Captain Sinclair's letter, a testament to a love that might have been, pressed heavily on Rose's heart. She sat in the dimly lit cafe, the sounds of the docks fading into a muted backdrop to the turmoil of her emotions. She had a choice to make, a path to forge, amidst the wreckage of shattered lives and broken promises. She decided to return to Nurse Davy's brother's farm. She needed to know if Eliza was safe, to offer what comfort and support she could. And, selfishly, perhaps, she needed the grounding presence of Nurse Davies, the woman who had become an unexpected anchor in the storm of her life. The journey back was fraught with a new kind of tension. Now that the initial adrenaline had faded, the full weight of the risks they had taken, the dangers they had faced, settled upon her. Every shadow seemed to conceal a potential threat. Every stranger's gaze felt like an accusation. When she arrived at the farm, it was shrouded in the quiet stillness of late evening. The farmhouse was dark, save for a single lamp burning in the downstairs room where Thomas Ashworth had been recovering. Rose approached cautiously, her heart pounding. She knocked softly on the door, her knuckles rapping against the weathered wood. Nurse Davies opened the door, her face etched with exhaustion, but her eyes held a spark of relief at seeing Rose. "You're back," she said, her voice low. "Thank God. I was worried. Is Eliza here?" Rose asked, her voice urgent. Nurse Davies nodded.
She is.
She arrived a few hours ago. Major Finch sent her. She's shaken, but safe. Rose felt a wave of relief wash over her. At least one good thing had come out of this chaotic mess. Eliza was safe. Nurse Davies led her inside, to the downstairs room. Eliza was sitting by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked up as Rose entered, her expression a mixture of fear and confusion. "Rose?" she said, her voice trembling. What's happening? Why am I here?" Rose knelt beside her, taking her hand. Her own hand was surprisingly steady, despite the turmoil within.
"It's a long story," she said.
"But you're safe now. That's all that matters." She spent the next hour explaining everything, as gently as she could, recounting the events of the past few days, the conspiracy, Thomas Ashworth's involvement, Major Finch's intervention. She omitted the details of her own growing feelings for Thomas, the complexities of that relationship too raw, too uncertain to share. Eliza listened intently, her eyes widening in disbelief, her hand gripping Rose's tightly. When Rose finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, her mind struggling to process the enormity of what she had heard. "Thomas," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. He was a traitor?" Rose nodded, her heart aching for Eliza.
"He was," she said. "But he was also forced. Coerced.
He did it to protect you." Eliza's eyes filled with tears.
I don't understand," she said. "Why would they target me?"
"Because you're brilliant," Rose said. "Because you're a codebreaker. Because you were a valuable asset, a way to control him." Eliza shook her head, her tears spilling down her cheeks. "I loved him," she said. "I trusted him." Rose put her arm around Eliza, offering what comfort she could. "I know," she said. "And I'm so sorry." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and Eliza's quiet sobs. Rose felt a profound sense of empathy for this woman, a shared grief for the loss of innocence, the shattering of trust. As the night deepened, Nurse Davies prepared a simple meal, and they ate together in silence, the weight of their shared experiences heavy in the air. Afterwards, Nurse Davies showed Eliza to a room upstairs, and Rose returned to the small room she had occupied before. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but sleep eluded her. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the past few days, the faces, the words, the betrayals, the sacrifices. She thought about Captain Sinclair, his letter, his declaration of love, a love that had been cut short, perhaps, by the ravages of war. She thought about Thomas Ashworth, his confession, his sacrifice, his uncertain future. She thought about Eliza, her shattered trust, her broken heart. And she thought about herself, about the changes she had undergone, the risks she had taken, the love she had found and lost and found again in the most unexpected of places. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a soft tapping at her door. She sat up, her heart pounding. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. A voice, low and familiar, answered. "It's me, Thomas." Rose's breath caught in her throat. Thomas?
But how?
Major Finch had taken him into custody. He was supposed to be she got out of bed and opened the door. Thomas stood in the hallway, his face shadowed, his expression unreadable. He was dressed in different clothes, not the ones he had been wearing when he left with Major Finch. Thomas? Rose said, her voice filled with disbelief. How did you get here? He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Major Finch released me, he said. He believed me. He understood. Rose stared at him, her mind struggling to make sense of this new development.
But why? How?
He explained that Major Finch, after further investigation, had uncovered evidence that corroborated Thomas's story, evidence that confirmed the threats against Eliza, evidence that pointed to a larger network of conspirators within the British government. Major Finch had realized that Thomas was more valuable as an ally than as a prisoner, that his knowledge and his connections could help them dismantle the entire network. He had released Thomas, under strict conditions, with a mission to infiltrate the network, to gather more evidence, to help them bring down the remaining traitors. It's dangerous, Thomas said. But it's the only way to redeem myself, to atone for what I've done. Rose felt a surge of relief, but also of fear. She knew the risks he was taking, the dangers he faced. I don't want you to go, she said, her voice trembling. I don't want you to risk your life. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a shiver through her. I have to, he said. It's the only way. They stood in silence for a long moment, their hands clasped together, their eyes locked in a gaze of unspoken emotion. The confession hung between them, unspoken but clear. Chapter 15. Beneath the pale moonlight. The silence in the small room was thick with unspoken emotions, the weight of their shared experiences, the uncertainty of their future, the undeniable pull that drew them together. Thomas stood before Rose, his hand clasped in hers, his eyes searching hers, a silent confession hanging in the air. I shouldn't have come, Thomas said, his voice low and husky, breaking the silence. It's too dangerous. For both of us. Rose shook her head, her gaze unwavering.
No, she said.
I'm glad you're here. I needed to see you. He squeezed her hand, his touch sending a warmth through her, a spark of hope in the darkness. I needed to see you too, he said. To tell you something. He hesitated, his eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and longing. I know it's inappropriate, he said. Given the circumstances, given my past, given everything. But I can't pretend any longer. He took a deep breath, his gaze locking on hers. I'm in love with you, Rose, he said, his voice raw with emotion. I have been almost from the moment I met you. I know it's wrong. I know it's foolish. I know I don't deserve you, but I can't help it. Rose's heart leaped in her chest, a mixture of joy and disbelief. She had sensed his feelings, had felt a connection to him that transcended the circumstances, the lies, the betrayals. But to hear him say the words, to hear him confess his love, was overwhelming. Thomas, she said, her voice trembling. I feel the same way. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope igniting in their depths. You do? Rose nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I do, she said. I know it's crazy. I know it's impossible, but I can't deny it. I love you too. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. Rose buried her face in his chest, her tears soaking his shirt, her body trembling with a mixture of relief and joy. They stood there for a long moment, embraced in the silence of the small room, their hearts beating in unison, their love a fragile flame in the darkness of war and betrayal. He gently tilted her chin up, his eyes searching hers. I know I don't deserve you, he said. I know I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But I swear to you, Rose, I'll do everything in my power to make amends, to prove myself worthy of your love. Rose met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a love that was both fierce and unwavering. I believe you, she said. I trust you. He lowered his head and kissed her, his lips soft and tentative at first, then growing more passionate, more demanding. Rose responded with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. It was a kiss of desperation, of longing, of a love that had been forged in the crucible of danger and shared secrets. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked in a gaze of shared passion and unspoken promises. "I have to go," Thomas said, his voice reluctant. "I have to get back. Before they realize I'm gone." Rose nodded, her heart aching at the thought of their separation.
"I know," she said.
"But be careful."
"Please."
"I will," he said. "And I'll come back to you. I promise." He kissed her again, a quick, desperate kiss. Then he turned and slipped out the door, disappearing into the darkness. Rose stood alone in the room, her body still trembling from his touch, her heart filled with a mixture of love and fear. She didn't know what the future held, if they would survive this ordeal, if their love would have a chance to blossom. But she knew one thing for sure. She would never forget this night, this moment, this confession of love beneath the pale moonlight filtering through the small window. She looked out the window, at the moon hanging high in the sky, casting a silvery glow across the landscape. She felt a sense of peace, of resolve, of a strength she didn't know she possessed. She would wait for him. She would hope for him. She would fight for him. And she would love him, no matter what the future held. She touched her lips, still tingling from his kiss, and whispered a silent prayer for his safety, for his return, for a future where they could be together, free from the shadows of war and betrayal. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, fraught with danger and uncertainty. But she was no longer alone. She had his love, his promise, and that was enough to give her the courage to face whatever lay ahead. The moonlight seemed to bathe her in a hopeful glow. Chapter 16. The Spy Who Loved Me. Rose spent the following days in a state of anxious anticipation, her thoughts consumed by Thomas and his perilous mission. She helped nurse Davies and Eliza around the farm, trying to keep busy, to distract herself from the constant worry that gnawed at her. But every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the window, sent her heart racing, her hopes soaring, only to be dashed again. Eliza, still recovering from the shock of Thomas's betrayal and subsequent redemption, remained withdrawn and quiet. Rose tried to offer comfort and support, but she knew that only time, and perhaps Thomas's safe return, could truly heal the wounds that had been inflicted. Nurse Davies, ever the pragmatist, focused on the practicalities of their situation, ensuring they had enough food and supplies, maintaining a watchful eye on the surrounding area, her network of contacts keeping her informed of any developments in the outside world. One evening, as Rose was sitting by the fire, reading a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, seeking solace in a world far removed from the dangers and uncertainties of her own, she heard a knock at the door. Her heart leaped into her throat. Could it be? Nurse Davies answered the door, her expression cautious. Rose held her breath, her eyes fixed on the doorway. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the fading light. It was Thomas. Rose rushed to him, her arms wrapping around him, her relief so profound it brought tears to her eyes. He held her tight, his body trembling slightly, his face buried in her hair. "You're back," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You're safe." "I'm back," he said, his voice husky. "And I have news." He pulled away slightly, his eyes searching hers. He looked exhausted, his clothes stained and torn, but his gaze was filled with a determined fire, a sense of purpose that sent a shiver of both fear and admiration through Rose. He told them about his mission, about his infiltration of the traitorous network, about the information he had gathered, the risks he had taken. He had uncovered evidence of a planned attack, a coordinated effort to sabotage a crucial Allied supply line, an act that could have devastating consequences for the war effort. He had managed to alert Major Finch, providing him with the details of the plot, the names of the conspirators, the location of the planned attack. Major Finch had acted swiftly, mobilizing his forces, disrupting the operation, arresting the traitors. "It's over," Thomas said. "The network has been dismantled. The threat has been neutralized." Rose felt a wave of relief wash over her, so intense it left her weak. They had done it. They had stopped the traitors. They had saved countless lives. They had contributed to the war effort in a way she had never imagined possible. But her relief was tempered by a lingering fear. "What about you?" she asked. "What will happen to you now?" Thomas smiled, a weary but genuine smile. "Major Finch has offered me a deal," he said. "Full immunity, in exchange for my continued cooperation. He wants me to work for him, to use my knowledge and my skills to help identify and apprehend other enemy agents." Rose stared at him, her mind reeling. He was going to become a spy, a counterintelligence agent, working for the very organization he had once betrayed. It was a dangerous, risky profession, but it was also a chance for him to redeem himself, to use his talents for good, to serve his country in a way that aligned with his newfound loyalty. "It's a dangerous job," Rose said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know," he said, "but it's the right thing to do. And it's the only way I can truly make amends for my past mistakes." He took her hand, his touch sending a warmth through her. "And it's the only way I can build a future for us," he said. "A future where we can be together, free from the shadows of the past." Rose met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a love that was both fierce and unwavering. "I'll be here," she said, "waiting for you. Always." He kissed her then, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their commitment, their love, their shared hope for a future that was still uncertain, but filled with the promise of redemption, of healing, of a love that had been forged in the crucible of war. He tasted of gunpowder and hope. The spy who loved her was going back into the shadows, but this time, he was on the right side. And Rose, the quiet nurse who had stumbled into a world of espionage and intrigue, would be waiting for him, her heart filled with a love that defied danger, defied betrayal, defied even the ravages of war. She glanced at Nurse Davies, who offered a small, rare, approving smile. There was hope yet. Chapter 17. A farewell at dawn. The decision had been made. Thomas would accept Major Finch's offer, embracing a new life as a counterintelligence agent, a dangerous path, but one that offered redemption and a chance to serve his country honorably. For Rose, it meant a life of waiting, of uncertainty, of stolen moments and whispered promises, but also a life filled with a love that had defied all odds, a love that had blossomed in the midst of war and betrayal. They spent the next few days at the farm, a brief respite from the dangers and uncertainties of the outside world, a chance to savor their newfound love, to strengthen the bond that had been forged in the crucible of shared secrets and perilous escapes. They talked for hours, sharing their pasts, their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. Rose learned about Thomas's childhood, his early ambitions, the events that had led him down the path of betrayal, the agonizing choices he had been forced to make. Thomas, in turn, learned about Rose's quiet life, her dedication to nursing, the loss of her brother, the strength she had found in the face of adversity. They walked in the fields, hand in hand, enjoying the simple pleasures of nature, the warmth of the sun on their skin, the scent of wildflowers in the air, the songs of birds in the trees. They found solace in each other's company, a comfort that transcended the circumstances, the dangers, the uncertainties that lay ahead. But the idyllic interlude couldn't last. The time came for Thomas to return to London, to begin his new life, his new mission. They woke before dawn, the sky still dark, the air crisp and cool. They dressed in silence, the weight of their impending separation heavy in the air. Rose made them tea, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the steaming liquid into 2 mugs. They sat at the kitchen table, their hands clasped together, their eyes locked in a gaze of unspoken emotion. "I don't want you to go," Rose said, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas squeezed her hand, his touch reassuring. "I know," he said, "but I have to. It's the right thing to do. And it's the only way we can have a future together." "But it's so dangerous," Rose said. "I'm afraid for you." "I'll be careful," he said. "I promise. And I'll come back to you. I swear it." They finished their tea in silence, the only sounds the ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint chirping of birds outside, heralding the approaching dawn. As the first rays of sunlight began to paint the sky with streaks of pink and orange, they walked outside, hand in hand, to the edge of the farmyard. A car was waiting, a dark, nondescript vehicle, driven by a man Rose didn't recognize, a man who Major Finch had sent to collect Thomas. They stood there for a long moment, their bodies close, their eyes locked in a gaze of love and longing. "I love you, Rose," Thomas said, his voice husky with emotion. "I love you too, Thomas," Rose said, her voice trembling. He kissed her then, a long, passionate kiss that was both a farewell and a promise, a kiss that sealed their commitment, their love, their shared hope for a future that was still uncertain, but filled with the possibility of happiness, of peace, of a life together, free from the shadows of the past. He pulled away, his eyes lingering on hers for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked towards the car. He got in, without looking back, and the car drove away, disappearing down the long, winding road, leaving Rose standing alone in the dawn, her heart aching with a mixture of love and loss, of fear and hope. She watched until the car was out of sight, then she turned and walked back towards the farmhouse, the rising sun casting a long shadow behind her, a symbol of the uncertain future that lay ahead. She knew that she might not see him for a long time, that his life would be filled with danger, with secrecy, with constant threats. But she also knew that their love was strong, that it had survived the trials of war and betrayal, that it would endure, no matter what the future held. She would wait for him. She would hope for him. She would pray for his safety, for his return. And she would live her life, her heart filled with a love that defied distance, defied danger, defied even the ravages of war. She would carry his love with her and live with a strength that belied her quiet nature. The dawn broke golden and clear. Chapter 18. The Trenches of the Heart. Life at the farm settled into a quiet routine, punctuated by the anxieties of waiting and the echoes of the tumultuous events that had brought Rose, Eliza, and Nurse Davies together. Rose threw herself into the daily chores, finding solace in the physicality of the work, the rhythm of the farm a balm to her restless spirit. She helped Nurse Davies tend to the animals, weed the garden, and prepare meals, her hands busy, her mind constantly replaying her moments with Thomas, clinging to the memory of his touch, his voice, his promise. Eliza remained withdrawn, her grief a palpable presence. She spent hours staring out the window, lost in her thoughts, the betrayal by the man she had loved casting a long shadow over her life. Rose tried to offer comfort, sharing her own experiences of loss and heartbreak, but she knew that only time, and perhaps Thomas's eventual success in dismantling the network that had shattered their lives, could truly heal Eliza's wounds. Nurse Davies, ever the stoic, continued to run the farm with her usual efficiency, her gruff exterior concealing a deep well of compassion and a fierce protectiveness towards the two younger women under her care. She received occasional, cryptic messages from Major Finch, updates on Thomas's progress, reassurances of his safety, which she shared with Rose, offering a glimmer of hope in the long stretches of silence. Rose, in turn, found herself drawn back to the world of nursing. The war continued to rage, the casualty lists growing longer with each passing day, and she felt a renewed calling to serve, to use her skills to alleviate suffering, to offer comfort to the wounded and the dying. She began volunteering at a small, local hospital, a makeshift facility housed in a converted schoolhouse, where she tended to soldiers returning from the front, their bodies and minds scarred by the horrors of the trenches. The work was grueling, emotionally draining, but it also gave Rose a sense of purpose, a way to connect with the larger struggle, a way to feel closer to Thomas, who was fighting his own battles in the shadowy world of espionage. She saw his face in the eyes of every wounded soldier, heard his voice in their whispered pleas for comfort, felt his presence in the constant struggle between life and death that played out in the makeshift wards. She wrote to him often, long, rambling letters filled with her thoughts, her feelings, her hopes, her fears, her love. She poured her heart out onto the page, creating a lifeline between them, a connection that transcended distance and danger. She knew that he might not receive her letters, that they might be intercepted, that they might never reach him, but she wrote them anyway, finding solace in the act of writing, in the belief that somehow her words would find their way to him. She received only one letter in return, a short, cryptic note, written in his familiar hand, assuring her that he was alive, that he was thinking of her, that he loved her. It was enough. It was a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the darkness. The war continued, its relentless grind consuming lives, shattering dreams, testing the limits of human endurance. Rose witnessed the suffering firsthand, the broken bodies, the haunted eyes, the despair that permeated the makeshift hospital. She saw young men, barely out of their teens, their lives irrevocably altered by the horrors they had witnessed, the traumas they had endured. She tended to their wounds, offered them comfort, listened to their stories, her heart aching for their losses, their pain, their shattered innocence. She found strength in her work, in her ability to alleviate suffering, to offer a moment of peace in the midst of chaos. But the trenches of the heart, the emotional wounds, were harder to heal. She carried her own scars, the memories of loss, of betrayal, of the constant fear for Thomas's safety. She battled her own demons, her own anxieties, her own doubts. But she also found a resilience she didn't know she possessed, a strength that grew from her love for Thomas, from her commitment to her work, from her belief in a better future. She learned to live with uncertainty, to embrace the present moment, to find joy in the small things, to cherish the memories of her time with Thomas, to hold on to the hope of his eventual return. She lived in the trenches of the heart, but refused to be buried. She survived. Chapter 19. The Reckoning. Months turned into a year, and the war, which had seemed like it would never end, finally began to wind down. The Allied forces, bolstered by the arrival of American troops and weakened by internal strife, pushed back the German lines, and the tide of the conflict turned decisively. The armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, and the guns fell silent, bringing an end to 4 years of unimaginable bloodshed and suffering. Rose received the news with a mixture of relief and trepidation. The war was over, but Thomas's war, his fight against the remnants of the traitorous network, continued. She had received no word from him in months, and the silence was a constant source of anxiety, a gnawing fear that something had happened to him. She continued her work at the hospital, tending to the returning soldiers, their bodies and minds bearing the scars of battle. The celebrations in the streets, the joyous reunions, the relief that swept through the nation, felt distant and unreal to her, overshadowed by the uncertainty of Thomas's fate. Eliza, gradually recovering from her ordeal, had returned to London, taking up a position at a government office, using her skills to help rebuild the shattered nation. She and Rose remained in contact, their shared experiences forging a bond of friendship that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. Nurse Davies remained at the farm, her gruff exterior softened by the passage of time, her heart filled with a quiet pride in the role she had played in the war effort, in the protection she had offered Rose and Eliza. One evening, as Rose was preparing to leave the hospital, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. It was Major Finch. Her heart leaped into her throat. Had something happened to Thomas? Major Finch approached her, his expression somber but not unkind. "Miss Kensington," he said, "I have news about Thomas Ashworth." Rose braced herself, her hands trembling, her breath caught in her throat. Is he alive?" Major Finch nodded.
He is, he said.
"But he's been injured. He's at a military hospital in London.
He's been asking for you."
Relief washed over Rose, so intense it left her weak. He was alive. He was injured, but he was alive. Major Finch offered to take her to the hospital, and Rose accepted, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The journey to London was a blur, her mind racing, her thoughts consumed by Thomas, by the image of him lying wounded, by the hope of finally seeing him again. They arrived at the hospital, a large, imposing building filled with the sounds of suffering and the smells of antiseptic and illness. Major Finch led her through a maze of corridors to a private room. He stopped outside the door, his hand on the knob. "He's not in good shape, Miss Kensington," he said. "Be prepared." Rose nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She was ready. She had faced worse. Major Finch opened the door, and Rose stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn, the air heavy with the scent of medication. Thomas lay in bed, his face pale and drawn, his body bandaged, his eyes closed. Rose rushed to his side, her heart aching at the sight of him, so vulnerable, so still. She knelt beside the bed, taking his hand in hers. His skin was cool to the touch, his pulse weak but steady. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It's me. It's Rose." His eyes flickered open, his gaze hazy, unfocused. He blinked, trying to make sense of his surroundings. Then his eyes met hers and recognition dawned. A faint smile touched his lips. "Rose," he whispered, his voice weak, barely audible. Tears welled in Rose's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "You're alive," she said, her voice trembling. "You're alive." He squeezed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "I told you I'd come back," he said. They stayed like that for a long time, their hands clasped together, their eyes locked in a gaze of love and relief. Rose told him about the armistice, about the end of the war, about her work at the hospital, about her longing for him. Thomas listened, his eyes never leaving hers, his smile growing stronger with each passing moment. He told her about his mission, about the final confrontation with the remaining members of the network, about the fight that had left him injured, but victorious. "It's over, Rose," he said. "It's finally over." The reckoning had come, not just for the traitors, but for them, for their love, for their future. The war had tested them, had scarred them, had tried to tear them apart, but it had also strengthened them, had forged a bond between them that was unbreakable.
They had survived.
They had endured. And now, finally, they could begin to build a life together, a life free from the shadows of the past, a life filled with the promise of peace, of healing, of a love that had defied all odds.
He squeezed her hand again.
The reckoning was complete. Chapter 20. A New Dawn. The days that followed were a blur of recovery and reunion. Thomas, though weakened by his injuries, began to heal, his strength returning with each passing day. Rose stayed by his side, tending to his needs, offering him comfort and support, their love a constant presence in the sterile hospital room. Major Finch visited frequently, updating them on the ongoing investigations, the trials of the remaining conspirators, the dismantling of the network that had threatened to undermine the war effort. He assured Thomas that his actions had been instrumental in bringing the traitors to justice, that his bravery and his dedication had been recognized at the highest levels. Eliza came to visit, her initial awkwardness and lingering hurt gradually giving way to a renewed sense of friendship with Thomas, a recognition of the sacrifices he had made, the redemption he had earned. They talked for hours, rebuilding the bridges that had been shattered by betrayal, forging a new connection based on shared experiences and mutual respect. Nurse Davies, too, made the journey to London, her gruff exterior melting away at the sight of Thomas and Rose together, her heart filled with a quiet pride in the resilience they had shown, the love that had blossomed amidst the chaos and danger. As Thomas's health improved, plans for the future began to take shape. He was offered a permanent position within British intelligence, a chance to continue serving his country, to use his skills and his knowledge to protect it from future threats. He accepted, with Rose's blessing, knowing that it was the right path for him, a way to atone for his past mistakes, to build a life of purpose and meaning. Rose, in turn, decided to continue her nursing career, her experiences during the war having solidified her commitment to caring for others, to alleviating suffering, to making a difference in the world. She found a position at a hospital in London, a place where she could use her skills and her compassion to help those in need. They found a small flat in a quiet neighborhood, a place to call their own, a sanctuary from the bustling city, a haven where they could build their life together. They furnished it simply, with pieces salvaged from the farm, mementos of their shared past, symbols of the resilience they had shown, the love that had sustained them. They married in the spring, a small, intimate ceremony, attended by Nurse Davies, Eliza, Major Finch, and a few close friends they had made during their time in London. Rose wore a simple white dress, a gift from Nurse Davies, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers, a reminder of the farm, of the simple beauty that had sustained them through the darkest days. Thomas wore his uniform, a symbol of his service, his commitment to his country, his dedication to a new life of honor and integrity. They exchanged vows, their voices filled with emotion, their eyes locked in a gaze of love and commitment. They promised to cherish each other, to support each other, to stand by each other, through whatever challenges the future might hold. The war had tested them, had scarred them, had tried to tear them apart. But it had also strengthened them, had forged a bond between them that was unbreakable, a love that had defied all odds, a love that had blossomed in the midst of chaos and danger. They had emerged from the trenches of the heart, scarred but not broken, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. As they walked out of the church, hand in hand, into the bright sunshine of a new day, they knew that their journey was just beginning. They faced the future with courage, with hope, with a love that would guide them, protect them, sustain them, through all the days to come. A new dawn had broken, not just for them, but for the world. The future was theirs. Epilogue. Years passed, and the scars of war, both physical and emotional, began to fade. Thomas and Rose settled into a comfortable rhythm, their lives intertwined, their love a constant presence, a source of strength and comfort. Thomas rose through the ranks of British intelligence, his sharp mind, his unwavering dedication, and his unique understanding of the enemy, making him an invaluable asset. He traveled the world, working undercover, protecting his country from new threats, his past a constant reminder of the importance of his work, the price of loyalty, the fragility of peace. Rose continued her nursing career, her compassion and her skill earning her the respect and admiration of her colleagues and patients. She found fulfillment in caring for others, in alleviating suffering, in making a difference in the world. She specialized in helping veterans, her own experiences during the war giving her a unique understanding of their needs, their traumas, their struggles to readjust to civilian life. They had children, 2 sons and a daughter, who grew up in a world that was vastly different from the one their parents had known. They learned about the war from history books, from stories told by their parents, from the occasional, carefully worded anecdotes shared by Major Finch, who became a close family friend, a godfather to their eldest son. The children knew that their father had been a spy, that their mother had been a nurse, that they had both played a role in the war effort, but they didn't know the full extent of their parents' experiences, the dangers they had faced, the secrets they had kept, the love that had blossomed amidst the chaos and betrayal. As the years went by, Thomas and Rose found themselves reflecting on their past, on the tumultuous events that had brought them together, on the choices they had made, the sacrifices they had endured. They spoke often of Captain Sinclair, the man who had unknowingly set them on their path, the man who had loved Rose from afar, the man whose legacy lived on in their hearts. They visited the farm occasionally, a pilgrimage to the place where their love had been tested, where they had found refuge, where they had made their promises to each other. Nurse Davies had passed away peacefully in her sleep, and her brother, Thomas, had sold the farm and moved to the coast, but the memories of their time there remained vivid, a constant reminder of the strength they had found in each other, the resilience they had shown. One evening, as they sat by the fire in their London flat, their children grown and gone, their lives winding down, Thomas reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, wooden box. "I found this," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "while I was clearing out some old files at the office." He opened the box and Rose gasped. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was Captain Sinclair's locket, the one that had been mentioned in his first letter, the one that had contained her photograph, the one that had been lost, presumed gone forever.
How?
Rose stammered, her eyes widening in disbelief. "It was recovered from a German safe house," Thomas explained. years after the war. It was classified, buried in the archives. I stumbled upon it by accident. Rose took the locket, her fingers trembling. She opened it, and there, inside, was her photograph, the one Edward had carried with him, the one that had captured Captain Sinclair's heart. And on the other side of the locket, a small, faded inscription. Trust the Rose. Tears welled in Rose's eyes, tears of grief, of joy, of a love that had transcended time, distance, and even death. She looked at Thomas, her heart overflowing with gratitude, with love, with a profound sense of peace. They had come full circle. The letter that knew too much had, in the end, brought them everything. The ghost of Captain Sinclair had, in a way, given them his blessing, his legacy living on in their love, in their lives, in the future they had built together. The pale moonlight had, eventually, been replaced by the warm light of the sun. The war was long over. Their love never ended.